She had learned very young how to carry silence without letting it crush her. Not the silence of empty rooms, but the heavier kind, the silence that followed questions no one expected her to answer, the looks that lingered just a breath too long, the polite pauses that came after her name were spoken with pity instead of respect. Clara Whitcomb was 26 years old, and already the village spoke of her as though her life had concluded. A widow, a word that settled over her like a final verdict, regardless of how many years still stretched ahead of her. That morning, the mist lay thick over the North Yorkshire hills, clinging to the hedgerows and softening the sharp lines of the land. From the narrow window of Whitcomb Cottage, Clara watched the fog rise slowly from the valley, as though the earth itself were exhaling after a restless night. Behind her, the house stirred. A soft cough drifted from the adjoining room, followed by the creak of a chair being adjusted with care. "Aunt Margaret," Clara called gently, turning from the window. "I'm quite all right, my dear," came the familiar reply. "Just slower than I used to be." Clara smiled faintly and crossed the small room. Whitcomb Cottage was modest. 2 bedrooms, a narrow sitting room, and a kitchen that smelled perpetually of tea and polished wood. But it was clean, orderly, and fiercely maintained. It had to be. Margaret Whitcomb sat by the hearth, wrapped in a wool shawl, her once sharp eyes dulled by age and illness. She had raised Clara after her parents' deaths, and had insisted years later on coming to live with her niece after Thomas Whitcomb's passing. Clara did not regret it. But responsibility, like grief, had a way of accumulating quietly. "I'll be late this afternoon," Clara said as she poured tea. "Mrs. Hawthorne wants me to review her ledgers again." Margaret nodded. "You're too capable for this village," she said softly. "They see only what suits them." Clara did not answer. She had learned that some truths did not require defending. She dressed with care. Dark wool, practical boots, her hair pinned neatly away. Mourning attire had become both shield and sentence. It kept assumptions at bay, but it also told the world she had nothing left to offer. Vanity, she had learned, was a luxury reserved for women whose futures were not under scrutiny. The road into the village was quiet, damp from the night's cold. Clara walked with steady purpose, ledger tucked beneath her arm, mind already sorting columns of numbers and unpaid obligations. She was nearly at the crossroads when the shouting began. A sharp, urgent sound cut through the morning haze. Then came the thunder of hooves. Clara looked up just as a large bay horse burst into view, reins trailing loose, its eyes wide with terror. Villagers scattered instinctively, retreating to the safety of stone walls and cartwheels. The horse veered wildly, hooves striking sparks from the road, heading straight toward the river bend where the bank dropped steep and unforgiving. Someone shouted for a groom. Someone else shouted for sense. No one moved. Clara did not think. She stepped forward. Her boots met the stones with deliberate calm as she raised her hands, palms open, voice low and steady. "Easy," she said, not loudly, but with certainty. "You're all right." The horse faltered, confused by her lack of fear. Clara moved slowly, every breath measured. She had learned years ago that animals recognize truth more readily than people. Fear could not be hidden from them. Neither could calm. "You're safe," she murmured. "Nothing is chasing you now." The horse's breathing slowed, muscles still taut but listening. A man's voice called sharply from behind her. "Madam, step back." She ignored it. She was close enough now to see the marks along the horse's flank, fresh welts, angry and deliberate. Someone had struck him hard, her hand extended, still patient. The horse lowered his head, nostrils flaring, then pressed his nose against her palm with a sound that was almost a sigh. Relief rippled through the gathered crowd. Only then did Clara hear the approaching hoofbeats behind her. A black mare slowed beside them, its rider dismounting with practiced ease. "Madam," the man said, his voice controlled but strained, "you've just saved a great deal more than a horse." Clara turned, keeping one hand on the animal's neck. The man before her was tall, dark-haired, his expression carefully restrained. His clothes were well cut but unshowy, his posture that of someone accustomed to command. There was something else, too. Grief, tightly contained. "That horse belongs to my family," he continued. "Or rather, it belonged to my brother." The words landed heavier than expected. Clara's fingers stilled. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. The man nodded once. "His name is Raven," he said. "My brother favored him. He hasn't trusted anyone since the accident." Something passed through the man's eyes then, guilt, perhaps, or a memory he had not intended to revisit. "I'm Julian Ashcombe," he said at last, "of Hawthorne Vale." Clara knew the name. Everyone did. She inclined her head. "Clara Whitcomb." Recognition flickered. "The widow," someone murmured from the crowd. Julian's gaze sharpened briefly at the whisper, then returned to her with renewed focus. "You handled him better than any groom I employ," he said. "Where did you learn?" "My husband worked with horses," Clara replied. "Before that, my uncle did. Animals speak plainly, if one listens." Julian looked at Raven, then back at her. "I would like to speak with you again," he said slowly. "If you permit it." Clara hesitated. She did not know then that this moment, this frightened horse, this quiet decision to step forward had already altered the course of both their lives, only that something long dormant had stirred. And that silence, once again, was about to demand an answer. The days after the incident at the crossroads did not return to their former shape. They only pretended to. Clara tried to resume her routines. Accounts in the morning, errands at midday, tea prepared by late afternoon for her aunt's aching joints, and small comforts. Yet everything felt subtly misaligned, as if her life had shifted half an inch to the side and refused to settle back. In the village, the story spread the way stories always did. Not with accuracy, with appetite. A widow had stood in the road and stopped a bolting horse with nothing but her voice and her hands. A widow had touched the Ashcombe family's prized bloodline. A widow had been seen speaking to Julian Ashcombe, unmarried, wealthy, and watched by every mother with a marriageable daughter. Clara heard the murmurs when she walked into the milliner's shop. She felt them in the slight delays of curtsies, the new sharpness behind polite greetings, and she did what she had always done. She kept her expression calm. She kept her head level. At home, Aunt Margaret listened to the village with a weary sort of understanding. "They will build an entire world out of one moment," Margaret said one evening, as Clara folded laundry near the hearth. "They always do." Clara's hands paused. "I didn't ask to be seen." "No," Margaret replied gently, "but you were." That was the unbearable part. Not the gossip itself, but the fact that for the first time in a long while, Clara felt alive beneath it. 2 days after the incident, a note arrived. It was delivered by a boy from the estate roads, breathless, as if he'd been told the message mattered enough to run. The paper was thick, the ink precise. "Mrs. Whitcomb, I hope you will forgive the directness of this request. I would like to call upon you at your cottage to speak regarding a matter of practical importance. I will come tomorrow at 3 o'clock. I will be accompanied by my head groom. Respectfully, Julian Ashcombe." Clara read it twice, then a third time, slower. Aunt Margaret watched her from the chair by the fire. "He's careful," she said, as if reading the lines between the words. "He knows what people will say. He has no reason to come here," Clara murmured, "and yet he does." The next day arrived grey and windless. Clara cleaned as though scrubbing would settle her nerves. She arranged the best tea service she owned, chipped at one rim, inherited from a mother whose voice she could barely remember. She pinned her hair neatly, then loosened it slightly, then pinned it again, annoyed at herself for caring. When the knock came, it was punctual, firm, certain. Clara opened the door to find Julian Ashcombe on her small step, hat in hand, shoulders squared beneath a dark coat. Behind him stood an older man with weathered cheeks and steady eyes, holding the reins of 2 horses. Julian's gaze moved briefly over the cottage, taking in its modesty without judgment. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, bowing just enough to be respectful without making a performance of it. "Mr. Ashcombe," Clara replied, stepping aside. "Please." He entered with measured restraint, as though the room were not small but sacred. The groom remained outside, as promised. Julian's eyes went to the desk in the corner, Clara's ledgers stacked in careful order, pages covered in tight columns of ink. Then he glanced toward the doorway, where Aunt Margaret sat, wrapped in a shawl, observing with quiet authority. Clara introduced them. Margaret offered a polite greeting, her voice thin, but her presence unmissable. Julian inclined his head to her. "I'm grateful for your hospitality, ma'am." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, not unkindly. "And I'm curious," she replied, "what brings you to my niece's door with such punctual confidence?" Julian's mouth twitched, the faintest hint of something like amusement. Then he turned fully to Clara. "I will not waste your time," he said. "I did not come that day because I was impressed." Clara blinked. He continued, voice steady. "I came because I was unsettled." Clara held his gaze, refusing to flinch. Julian drew a breath. "Raven was my brother's horse. He was calm with him in a way I've never seen with anyone else. After my brother's death, the animal became a reminder." His jaw tightened. "A reminder of what I failed to prevent," he added quietly. The room seemed to grow smaller around the confession. Clara felt something in her chest soften. Not pity, not exactly, but recognition. "Someone struck him," she said, her practical mind anchoring itself to what she could solve. "Recently?" Julian nodded once. "Yes, and I suspected something was wrong long before that moment in the road." He stepped closer to the desk, gaze sliding again to her ledgers. "I asked questions," he said. "I pressed my men. I examined accounts. I believed I could manage everything alone." There was a hardness in the words, like a habit he had never questioned. "And you failed," Aunt Margaret said bluntly, as if he'd invited honesty by stepping into their home. Julian did not bristle. He simply looked at Margaret, then back at Clara. "Yes," he said, "I failed." Clara's hands folded in her lap. "Then why are you here?" Julian's gaze held hers, direct as winter air. "Because I need someone who can see what I don't," he said. "Someone who can move between my stables and my accounts without treating either like an inconvenience." He paused, then continued more carefully. "Someone who understands the dignity of work, but also the fragile rules that govern how people speak to one another when wealth and reputation are involved." Clara felt the words settle. He was describing her, not her grief, not her widowhood, her. "What are you asking?" she said softly. Julian reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. Not a love letter, not a proposal in the romantic sense. Something far more dangerous. "I want to offer you employment," he said, "in an official capacity." Clara's heart thudded once, hard. "Employment," she repeated, as if the word might shift in meaning if she said it aloud. "Yes," Julian said. "The estate is large. My steward maintains the books, my men maintain the land, but there is a gap between the house and the farms, between decisions and consequences." He hesitated, then added, "And I need the gap bridged by someone I can trust." Aunt Margaret made a soft sound, half approval, half warning. Clara's mind raced. It was an opportunity and a risk. The village would feast on it, a young widow, an unmarried landowner, a new arrangement. 1,000 insinuations. Julian seemed to anticipate the thought. "Every visit would be properly chaperoned," he said quickly. "My head groom or my housekeeper or my steward's clerk. Whatever makes you most comfortable. It would be formal, documented." Clara studied him. He was not charming her. He was constructing safeguards. And yet, even with all that careful structure, there was something raw behind his composure, as though he had reached the edge of his own endurance and finally admitted he could not carry it alone. "What would I do?" Clara asked. Julian's eyes sharpened with focus, grateful for the practical question. "You would review accounts related to the farms," he said. "You would visit tenant cottages, observe operations, identify inefficiencies. You would tell me what is being neglected, what is being hidden, and what is being harmed." Clara's fingers tightened slightly. "And if I find corruption?" Julian's expression turned cold in a way that startled her. "Then we remove it," he said simply. The steadiness of his tone made it sound less like a promise and more like inevitability. Clara swallowed. "And the compensation?" Julian named a sum. Clara's breath caught despite herself. It was not merely fair, it was life-altering. Aunt Margaret's gaze flicked to Clara, and Clara could feel her aunt calculating what that money could mean. Medicine, food, warmth in winter, debts eased, freedom regained. Clara steadied her voice. "That is generous," she said carefully. "Too generous." Julian's eyes held hers. "I'm not paying for your silence," he said, as if hearing the suspicion before she voiced it. "Nor for your company. I'm paying for your competence." He paused, then added with quiet bluntness, "and for the inconvenience you will endure, because people will not understand a woman being valued for her mind." The words struck like a hand on a locked door. Clara sat very still. Outside, a wind stirred the hedge. Inside, the air felt charged, not with romance but with possibility. "You said you tried to manage alone," Clara said. "How long?" Julian's gaze went distant for a moment. "Long enough," he answered. Clara looked down at her hands, then back up. "I will consider it," she said. Julian's shoulders eased by a fraction, as though he had not expected even that. Aunt Margaret's voice cut softly into the quiet. "My niece has one rule," she said. "She will not be used." Julian turned to her without offense. "Nor would I try," he replied. "I'm tired of games." Clara's throat tightened. She had not realized how much she wanted to hear that. Julian rose, hat still in hand. "I'll leave the papers," he said. "Read them. Mark what you dislike. Ask for what you need. If you choose to refuse, I will accept it without argument." He paused at the door, then looked back at her. "And, Mrs. Whitcomb, thank you again." Clara's fingers curled around the edge of the chair. "Over the horse?" she asked. Julian's gaze held hers, steady and unguarded for the briefest moment. "For reminding me," he said quietly, "that control is not the same as strength." Then he left, and Clara sat in the silence he had brought with him. A silence that no longer felt like an ending. The first rumor reached Clara before her decision did. It arrived folded into polite conversation, carried on lowered voices and careful glances, as though discretion itself could soften its intent. "She's been seen," Mrs. Hawthorne said lightly, adjusting ribbons that did not need adjusting. "At her cottage. With him." Clara did not look up from the ledger she was correcting. "With whom?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Mrs. Hawthorne smiled too quickly. "Mr. Ashcombe, of course. I suppose business arrangements now require personal visits." The words hovered, sharpened by implication. Clara finished her column, closed the book, and met the woman's eyes with calm she did not feel. "Some arrangements require clarity," she said. "Confusion tends to be expensive." Mrs. Hawthorne flushed, then laughed as if nothing had been meant at all. By the time Clara reached home that evening, the rumor had evolved. She had been invited. She had been persuaded. She had been rescued. Each version stripped her of agency in a different way. Aunt Margaret listened as Clara removed her coat, her movements slower than usual. "They're testing the shape of the story," Margaret said quietly, "to see which version sticks." "And if I accept the position," Clara replied. "They will choose the worst one." Margaret studied her niece with eyes that had seen decades of small cruelties disguised as concern. "And if you refuse?" Clara hesitated. "Then I return to being harmless," she said. "Invisible, useful only in quiet corners." Margaret reached for her hand. "And what do you want?" Clara did not answer at once. That night, she read the papers Julian Ashcombe had left behind. They were precise, thorough, written with care rather than flourish. There were no hidden clauses, no language that suggested dependency or obligation beyond the professional. There was, however, something else. Expectation, not of obedience, of competence. She slept poorly, her thoughts circling the same question until dawn crept grey and unconvincing through the curtains. 2 days later, Clara rode to Hawthorne Vale. She did not send word ahead. She arrived with the groom Julian had assigned, a quiet man named Elias, who spoke little and observed much. The estate unfolded before her in measured grandeur, fields stretching outward like an unspoken challenge, stone buildings anchored in history, order maintained by habit rather than reflection. Julian was waiting near the stables. He did not smile when he saw her. He searched her face instead, as if bracing for an answer he did not yet deserve. "I accept," Clara said before he could speak. Something shifted in his posture. Not relief exactly, but the release of tension held too long. "Thank you," he said simply. "We'll begin carefully." Careful, Clara learned, did not mean gentle. By midday, she had met the steward. Mr. Harrington was a man of 60, with neatly trimmed whiskers and a gaze sharpened by decades of keeping order. He bowed politely, but his eyes assessed her the way one examined a ledger entry that did not quite align. "So," he said, folding his hands, "you are the solution." Clara met his gaze evenly. "I'm here to ask questions." Harrington's mouth tightened. "We have systems." "So do I," Clara replied. "They tend to reveal different things." The resistance was not loud. It was quieter than that. Harrington answered her inquiries with precision, but not warmth. The overseers complied, but slowly. Information came in fragments, as though being rationed. Julian noticed. He said nothing, at least not publicly. That afternoon, Clara walked the tenant cottages with Elias trailing at a respectful distance. She listened more than she spoke, her questions simple, her attention exacting. Patterns emerged, delayed repairs, feed costs higher than recorded, work done twice because it had been done poorly the first time, none of it criminal, all of it expensive. By the time she returned to the main house, she was exhausted and quietly certain. Julian waited in the study, papers spread across the desk. "Well?" he asked. "You have inefficiencies," Clara said, "and loyalties." His brow furrowed. "Harrington," she added. Julian leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "He served my family for 30 years. "Yes," Clara said, "and he believes service entitles him to control." The words landed between them without apology. Julian studied her, not defensively, but with interest. "You're sure?" he said. "I am," she replied. "He's not corrupt, he's protective. Of his authority." Julian nodded slowly. "Then we proceed carefully," he said. "I won't undermine him outright." "That would be unwise," Clara agreed. "He would only retreat further." Their gazes met, something like understanding passing between them. It was the first time Clara felt less like an outsider and more like an equal participant in something that mattered. By the end of the week, the rumor had grown teeth. Clara heard it in the market, in the churchyard, in the way conversations paused when she approached. She was ambitious, she was inappropriate, she was positioning herself. Julian heard it too. He said nothing, until Friday. The assembly invitation arrived that morning, sealed and unmistakable. The harvest gathering was not merely social, it was a public accounting of reputation. Julian studied the card in silence. "This is deliberate," he said at last. "They want to see how you'll handle it," Clara replied. "And you?" he asked. "What do you want to do?" The question surprised her. "I want," she said slowly, "to attend, as your consultant, not as spectacle." Julian nodded once. "Then that is how it will be." He paused, then added, "But you should know, this will not be the first story they tell about you." Clara met his gaze, steady despite the tightening in her chest. "It already isn't," she said. That evening, as Clara prepared to leave the estate, Harrington intercepted her near the stable doors. "You should be careful," he said quietly. "People talk." Clara looked at him calmly. "They always have," she replied. "The difference is that now they're listening." Harrington studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head, just enough to suggest reluctant respect. Julian watched from the steps of the house. He said nothing, but something in his expression had changed. Not admiration, not yet. Something more complicated. Something like recognition. And Clara rode home beneath a sky heavy with gathering clouds, aware that she had crossed a threshold she could not uncross. The work had begun, and so had the waiting. By the time the harvest assembly arrived, the rumors had acquired names, not facts. Names. They moved through the county the way fog moved through the low fields, settling into corners, softening edges, making it difficult to tell where truth ended and invention began. Clara felt them long before she heard them. In the way shopkeepers lingered before offering change, in the way invitations arrived late, if at all, in the careful recalibration of how people looked at her, not openly hostile, but no longer neutral. Julian did not comment on any of it. That too was deliberate. The carriage arrived at Whitcomb Cottage just before dusk, as promised. Elias stepped down first, composed and watchful, then opened the door for Clara. She wore black, still, appropriate, unremarkable, but the cut was newer, cleaner, not ornate, not submissive, respectable. Aunt Margaret stood in the doorway as Clara adjusted her gloves. "They will watch you," she said softly, "and they will wait for you to falter." Clara leaned down and pressed a kiss to her aunt's cheek. "Then I won't," she replied. The assembly hall in Thornley glowed with lamplight and polished wood, filled with voices layered in laughter, speculation, and practiced civility. It was a gathering meant to celebrate labor and land, but everyone present understood its true function: visibility. Julian stood near the entrance when Clara arrived, composed as ever, his expression neutral to the point of restraint. When he saw her, he inclined his head in greeting. No lingering glance, no personal warmth, just acknowledgement. She felt the decision in it. They entered together, not as a couple but as a unit. Conversation stalled and resumed in uneven waves as heads turned. Clara registered the glances with professional detachment. She had prepared for this. Introductions followed. "Mrs. Whitcomb, my agricultural consultant." Julian said it with the same tone he used for estate matters, and Clara repeated it silently like armor. Most accepted it. Some did not. Miss Rowland was among the latter. Young, well-dressed, and flanked by a mother whose eyes never rested, she smiled as Clara was presented, then tilted her head with practiced curiosity. "How unusual," she said. "I wasn't aware such positions existed." "They do," Clara replied evenly, "wherever inefficiency does." A few nearby guests smiled despite themselves. Julian did not intervene. He did not need to. As the evening progressed, Clara noticed the pattern. Questions framed as compliments, observations disguised as concern, each one designed to test the boundaries of her composure. She answered what mattered. She ignored what did not. And slowly, subtly, the room adjusted, until Edmund Hale arrived. He came late, as men who enjoyed control often did. Tall, Broad-shouldered, dressed with a precision that spoke of money hard-earned and power carefully wielded, Hale moved through the room as though it already belonged to him. His gaze found Julian almost immediately, then Clara, and lingered. "Well?" Hale said, approaching with a glass in hand. "If it isn't Hawthorne Vale's newest innovation." Julian turned to face him, expression cool. "Hale," he said, "I hadn't realized you'd been invited." Hale smiled, sharp and unembarrassed. "I'm difficult to exclude." His eyes flicked to Clara again. "And you must be Mrs. Whitcomb." Clara inclined her head. "Mr. Hale." "I hear you've been quite busy," Hale continued. "Walking farms, reviewing accounts, advising." "Efficiency requires attention," Clara replied. Hale chuckled. "So does ambition." Julian stepped slightly forward, not protectively, but strategically. "Mrs. Whitcomb works under my authority," he said. "If you have questions about her role, address them to me." Hale's smile widened. "Oh, I intend to." The music resumed, but the tension did not. As the evening wore on, Clara became aware of a shift in the room's energy. Conversations quieted too abruptly, glances sharpened. Something was coming. It announced itself not with shouting but with precision. A man Clara recognized only vaguely, thin, neatly dressed, eyes too alert, stepped forward beside Hale near the center of the hall. "Mr. Ashcombe," the man said loudly enough to carry, "a matter of business, if you please." Julian did not move. "This hardly seems appropriate," he said. "Oh, I think it's necessary," the man replied. "Transparency benefits everyone." Hale watched, pleased. The man cleared his throat. "It has come to my attention," he said, "that Mrs. Whitcomb carries unresolved financial obligations from her late husband's estate, obligations which, until now, have gone conspicuously unpaid." A hush fell. Clara felt the air leave the room. Not panic, not shame. Anger. She stepped forward. "I have requested documentation of these claims repeatedly," she said, her voice steady. "None has been provided." The man smiled thinly. "That can be arranged." Julian raised a hand. "No," he said calmly. "This will not proceed in this manner." Hale leaned in, voice low but audible. "Afraid of scrutiny, Ashcombe?" Julian turned to him, expression glacial. "Afraid of slander," he replied. "There is a difference." He looked back to the room. "Any claims regarding Mrs. Whitcomb's finances are subject to legal review," he said. "Public insinuation serves no purpose but spectacle." There was no passion in his defense, no declaration, only authority. It was enough. The vicar stepped forward. "This gathering is not a courtroom," he said. "If there are accusations, they may be addressed privately." Murmurs followed, some disappointed, some relieved. Hale's eyes narrowed. "This isn't finished," he said quietly to Clara this time. "I know," she replied. Later, in the carriage ride home, silence filled the space between Clara and Julian. Not awkward, weighted. "You handled that well," Julian said at last. "So did you," Clara replied. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "They wanted me to react," he said. "Emotion would have confirmed their narrative." Clara nodded. "And legality unsettles them more." The carriage rolled on through the darkened roads. At her cottage, Julian helped her down without lingering. "Tomorrow," he said, "we review the ledgers together." Clara paused. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Only after the carriage disappeared did she allow herself to breathe fully. The assembly had not destroyed her, but it had drawn lines. And on the other side of those lines, consequences were already gathering. Morning arrived without ceremony, no sudden clarity, no dramatic shift in the light, only the quiet persistence of responsibility. Clara rose early, as she always did, her thoughts already arranging themselves into lists, figures to verify, conversations to revisit, implications to prepare for. The harvest assembly lingered at the edges of her mind, not as embarrassment, but as warning. What had been suggested publicly would now be pursued privately. She felt certain of it. At Hawthorne Vale, Julian was already awake when she arrived. The house carried the subdued tension of a place accustomed to order but bracing for disruption. Servants moved efficiently, voices low, eyes observant. They had heard. Everyone had. Julian waited in the smaller study rather than the main office, a deliberate choice. Papers were laid out neatly, but he had not begun without her. "You're early," he said. "So are consequences," Clara replied. A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. They worked in silence at first. Clara reviewed ledgers related to tenant payments, livestock feed, and maintenance schedules. Julian watched, occasionally answering questions, occasionally learning something new about his own estate. Patterns sharpened, figures repeated. Margins thinned where they should not have. After an hour, Clara closed one book and opened another. "These entries," she said, tapping the page, "appear consistently altered." Julian leaned closer. "Harrington?" "Yes," Clara replied, "but not alone." Julian straightened. "You're sure?" "I wouldn't say it otherwise." She slid a paper toward him, copied figures, dates aligned, discrepancies isolated. "It's subtle," she continued. "Amounts small enough to escape notice individually. Together they form a pattern of redirection, not theft, influence." Julian's jaw tightened. "Who benefits?" he asked. "Mr. Hale," Clara said quietly. Julian exhaled through his nose. "Of course." They sat with that knowledge for a moment, neither rushing to fill the silence. "What happens now?" Julian asked. "We gather proof," Clara replied. "And we do it slowly." Harrington entered not long after, summoned under the pretense of routine review. He greeted Julian with practiced respect, then turned to Clara with guarded civility. "You wished to see me?" Julian gestured to the chair. "Mrs. Whitcomb has identified irregularities." Harrington stiffened. "Irregularities, not errors," Clara said calmly. "Choices." Harrington's eyes sharpened. "You're new here?" "So is the pattern," she replied. The exchange stretched taut. Julian intervened before it snapped. "We'll audit the West accounts," he said. "Quietly, no accusations." Harrington nodded stiffly. "As you wish." When he left, the air shifted. "He knows," Julian said. "Yes," Clara agreed, "which means time matters." By midday, confirmation arrived. A note, delivered discreetly, unsigned, short. "He will push harder. He believes you are vulnerable. Protect your name before he destroys it." Clara stared at the paper. Julian read it over her shoulder. "This is intimidation," he said. "It's escalation," she corrected. The decision formed between them without words. "I'll step back," Clara said. Julian turned sharply. "No." "Temporarily," she clarified, "publicly, to protect the work." Julian's expression hardened. "You shouldn't have to." "I know," Clara said. "But if I remain, he'll frame everything as influence. If I leave, his leverage weakens." Julian paced once, then stopped. "How long?" "As long as it takes," she said. "Silence can be strategic." He studied her, conflict evident in the way his hands clenched and unclenched. "This wasn't what I intended," he said. "I know," Clara replied. "That's why it matters." The announcement was made that afternoon. Brief, formal, respectable. Mrs. Whitcomb would be stepping away from her consulting duties, pending review of certain matters. No details, no drama. The village responded immediately. Some satisfied, some suspicious, some disappointed. Julian did not seek Clara out after that, neither did she write. Days passed, then another. Silence, once imposed, settled deeply. Clara returned to her smaller work, parish accounts, household management, caring for her aunt. The quiet felt heavier now, weighted with things left unsaid. Julian worked longer hours. His presence in the county diminished. Hale grew bolder, his visits more frequent, his confidence sharper. And still, no word passed between Clara and Julian. Until the 5th evening. A letter arrived, handwritten, unmistakable. Clara did not open it at once. She held it, feeling the weight of what silence had already cost, and wondering what it was about to demand. The letter waited on the table long after the kettle had cooled. Clara sat across from it, hands folded, as though the paper itself might speak if given enough time. Outside, evening settled into the valley with the quiet confidence of something inevitable. Aunt Margaret dozed by the fire. Clara finally broke the seal. The handwriting was restrained, precise, the words chosen with care rather than impulse. Mrs. Whitcomb, I have spent the past 4 days attempting to complete my work without the clarity your presence provides. I have failed. This is not an appeal. It is an acknowledgement. If you are willing, I ask that you meet me tomorrow evening at Hawthorne Vale. Privately. J. Ashcombe. Clara read it twice. Then she folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the table. An acknowledgement, not an apology, not yet. The next evening arrived with low clouds and a wind that carried the promise of rain. Clara dressed plainly, her movements steady, her mind already prepared for several possible outcomes. She left no note behind. Aunt Margaret knew where she was going. The estate gates were open when she arrived. Elias met her near the drive, his expression unreadable. He's in the west wing, he said quietly. He dismissed the staff. Clara nodded. The house felt different without its usual rhythm, too still as though holding its breath. Lamps glowed faintly along the corridor, casting long shadows across the floors. Julian waited in the study. He stood when she entered but did not move toward her. I won't keep you long, he said. Then speak plainly, Clara replied. He did. I mishandled this, Julian said. Not the work, the silence. Clara remained standing. Silence was my choice. Yes, he agreed, but I accepted it too easily. He crossed to the desk and placed several documents before her. Hale's accounts, he said, and Harrington's correspondence. Clara scanned the papers quickly. It was enough. Hale had overreached. So you didn't need me, she said. Julian's jaw tightened. I did, just not in the way I thought. He paused, then spoke again, slower. I believed I was protecting you by remaining distant, by letting procedure speak instead of presence. Clara lifted her gaze. And I learned, he said, that absence can be as loud as interference. The admission hung between them. Clara stepped closer, not to him, but to the fire, grounding herself. I didn't leave because I was afraid, she said quietly. I left because the work mattered more than being seen. Julian nodded. I see that now. He hesitated. I've never been good at partnerships, he continued. I learned early that attachment complicates control. Clara turned to face him. And control has cost you. Yes, he said simply. Rain began against the windows, soft but persistent. Julian took a breath, as though steadying himself. I won't ask you to return as before, he said. If you choose to come back, it will be as something different. Clara waited. As my equal, he said. In the work, in decisions. Her pulse steadied, not quickened. And in everything else? She asked. Julian met her gaze without evasion. I don't know, he said. I only know I cannot continue as I was. Silence followed, not imposed, chosen. Clara felt the weight of the moment settle, not as romance, but as truth. I will return, she said at last, but not immediately. Julian inclined his head. Then I will wait. She moved toward the door, then paused. You should know, she added. Hale will not accept defeat quietly. Julian's expression hardened. Neither will I. Outside, the rain fell steadily as Clara walked back through the empty corridors. She did not feel victorious. She felt aligned, and that she knew was far more dangerous. The rain did not stop for 3 days. It softened the roads, darkened the fields, and slowed the pace of the valley into something quieter, more deliberate. Clara welcomed it. Rain gave people an excuse to remain indoors, to postpone questions, to let attention drift elsewhere. But Edmund Hale did not drift. His carriage appeared at Hawthorne Vale on the 4th morning, polished and unmistakable, cutting through the wet gravel as if announcement were its purpose. Julian watched from the window of the main study, expression unreadable. "He won't wait," Elias said from behind him. "No," Julian replied. "He never does." Hale entered the house without hesitation, coat already removed, confidence worn like a second skin. "You're avoiding me," he said by way of greeting. Julian gestured toward the chair opposite the desk. "I've been occupied." Hale smiled thinly. "With the widow?" Julian's gaze sharpened. "Choose your words carefully." Hale sat anyway. "You made a mistake, Ashcombe, letting her in, letting her see things that were never meant to concern her." "She saw what was already there," Julian replied. "That's not the same thing." Hale leaned forward. "You think removing her will end this, that a polite pause will restore order?" Julian did not answer. Hale's smile widened. "You underestimate how invested I am in your failure." The words landed heavily. "My father watched yours lose control," Hale continued. "Watched him hesitate, apologize, retreat." Julian stood slowly. "My father was ill." "He was weak," Hale corrected, "and you're proving to be much the same." The insult was deliberate. So was Julian's restraint. "This conversation is over," Julian said. Hale rose as well, his expression sharpening. "It's only beginning." He left without another word. That evening, the first letter arrived at Whitcomb Cottage. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, deliberately neat, carefully impersonal. "You should reconsider your involvement. Some reputations do not survive correction." Clara read it once, then placed it into the fire without comment. Aunt Margaret watched the flame consume the paper. "They're frightened," she said. "No," Clara replied. "They're cornered." The second letter arrived the next day. This one was bolder. It referenced Thomas's name, his debts, his mistakes. Clara's hand tightened as she read. That night she did not burn it. She carried it with her to Hawthorne Vale. Julian was in the smaller study again when she arrived, papers spread across the desk, his expression dark with concentration. She placed the letter before him without a word. He read it slowly, then he folded it once, carefully. "This ends now," he said. "It's already begun," Clara replied. "This is pressure, not resolution." Julian looked at her. "Then we apply our own." They worked late into the night, assembling records, correspondence, timelines. Clara moved through the information with quiet precision, noting inconsistencies, tracing influence. By midnight, the shape of the truth stood clearly between them. Hale had not only manipulated accounts, he had orchestrated perception. He had whispered where proof was thin, exaggerated where doubt already lived. "People believe him," Julian said quietly. "They believe confidence," Clara replied, "not truth." Julian leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I was raised to avoid conflict," he said, "to manage quietly." "And now?" Clara asked. "And now I see what silence protects." He turned to her, something resolute in his expression. "I will confront him," he said, "publicly." Clara considered. "That will escalate." "Yes," Julian agreed, "but it will also end the guessing." The county meeting was scheduled for the following week. It would be attended by landowners, magistrates, stewards, and Edmund Hale. When the day arrived, the hall filled quickly. Clara entered beside Julian, not announced, not hidden, present. Hale noticed immediately. His smile sharpened. Julian waited until the appropriate moment. Then he stood. "I have reviewed my estate's accounts," he said calmly, "with independent consultation." The words rippled. "Certain discrepancies were identified," he continued, "patterns of influence tied to one individual." Hale laughed softly. "Is this where you blame me for your mismanagement?" Julian met his gaze. "This is where I present evidence." Papers were distributed. Murmurs followed. Hale's confidence faltered, just briefly. Clara watched it happen, watched control slip. "This is fabrication," Hale said sharply. "It's documentation," Clara replied, speaking for the first time. "There is a difference." The room stilled. Hale turned toward her, eyes blazing. "You have no standing here." Julian stepped forward. "She has mine." Silence followed, not the suffocating kind, the decisive kind. Hale's voice rose, then broke. He argued, deflected, accused, but the structure had already collapsed. By the time the meeting adjourned, Hale stood isolated, not condemned, but exposed. Outside, the sky cleared for the first time in days. Clara exhaled slowly. "It's not finished," she said. "No," Julian replied, "but it's begun properly." They stood together in the fading light, not triumphant, not relieved, just steady. And for the first time since the crossroads, Clara felt no need to prepare for retreat. The aftermath did not arrive all at once. It seeped in, measured, reluctant, uneven. For days after the county meeting, Hawthorne existed in a state of suspended attention. People spoke more carefully. Letters were written and rewritten before being sent. Visits were postponed under the guise of courtesy. Edmund Hale did not appear. That absence, Clara knew, was intentional. "He's deciding his next move," she said quietly, standing at the window of the smaller study. Julian nodded. "He's not used to being forced into silence." "No," Clara agreed. "He prefers to control the sound." The estate resumed its rhythms cautiously. Harrington moved through his duties with visible restraint now, his authority intact but narrowed. Orders were followed more precisely. Questions once deflected were answered. It was progress, not peace. Julian invited Clara to resume her role officially at the end of the week. The announcement was brief, factual, impossible to misinterpret. No apology, no explanation, just reinstatement. Clara accepted without ceremony. She arrived on Monday morning as she always had, early, prepared, attentive. The difference was subtle but undeniable. Doors opened more readily. Eyes met hers directly. She was no longer the subject of speculation. She was a known quantity. By midday, she had reorganized 3 overlapping responsibilities and reassigned one authority Harrington had quietly retained for years. He did not object. That, more than anything, confirmed the shift. In the afternoon, Julian asked her to walk the western fields with him. The ground was still damp from recent rains, the air cool and clear. "This land was neglected after my brother died," Julian said, stopping near the fence line. "I couldn't bring myself to address it." Clara studied the soil, the fencing, the patterns left by animals and weather. "Grief narrows attention," she said. "It doesn't erase responsibility. It just makes it harder to carry." Julian looked at her. "You speak as though you know." "I do," she replied. They continued in silence. Not avoidance, companionship. That evening, Clara stayed late to finish a set of revised ledgers. When she finally gathered her things, the house was quiet, lamps dimmed, servants long dismissed. Julian waited by the door. "You don't need to stay this late," he said. "I wanted to," Clara replied. He hesitated. "May I walk you to the gate?" he asked. It was not an invitation weighted with implication, just courtesy. They stepped into the cool evening together, the gravel crunching softly beneath their boots. For a time, neither spoke. "I've been thinking," Julian said eventually. About what you said. About partnership. Clara glanced at him. And I'm not sure I know how to begin, he admitted, without retreating or controlling. Clara considered. Then don't begin with certainty. He frowned slightly. Begin with honesty, she continued, and let the rest take shape. They stopped near the gate. Julian turned toward her, his expression serious, unguarded. There are things about me that do not soften easily, he said. I don't want to pretend otherwise. I wouldn't trust you if you did, Clara replied. Something shifted then, not a declaration, a recognition. He did not reach for her. Neither did she step away. Instead, they stood, close enough to feel the quiet presence of one another without crossing any line that could not be uncrossed. I don't know where this leads, Julian said. Clara met his gaze steadily. Neither do I. And that doesn't frighten you. It does, she said, but less than returning to silence. Julian nodded slowly. I will not ask you for certainty, he said, only for truth. Clara's voice was calm when she answered. Then you may have it. They parted without touching, without promises, but when Clara walked home beneath the emerging stars, her steps felt lighter, not because danger had passed, but because something else had taken its place. Not hope, resolve. And at Hawthorne Vale, Julian remained at the gate long after she disappeared from sight, aware that whatever followed would require more courage than any confrontation he had yet faced. The quiet did not last. It never did. 3 days after Clara's return to Hawthorne Vale, the first legal notice arrived, formal, impeccably phrased, and unmistakably hostile. It was delivered not by messenger, but by solicitor, as if the weight of language itself might compensate for the lack of substance. Julian read it in silence. Then he read it again. Clara waited, seated across from him, hands folded, already anticipating the shape of the threat. He's contesting the audit, Julian said at last, claiming procedural impropriety, influence, coercion. Clara exhaled slowly. As expected. He's also demanding a temporary injunction, Julian added, to suspend any changes made under your consultation. The words were precise, calculated, designed to restore doubt. Julian set the paper down. If this proceeds, it becomes public, fully, Clara nodded, and if it doesn't, he'll continue quietly. Silence settled, not heavy but focused. We'll respond, Clara said, with structure, not reaction. Julian studied her. You're certain? I am, she replied, but we must be prepared for what follows. What follows, Julian said quietly, is scrutiny. Yes, Clara agreed. Of me. Of you. Of every decision. Julian leaned back, gaze lifting to the ceiling. I once believed reputation was built by avoiding exposure, he said. Now I see it's built by surviving it. Clara allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The solicitor arrived 2 days later. He was courteous, reserved, and unimpressed by charm. Clara respected him immediately. They spent hours reviewing documentation, accounts, correspondence, dates aligned with purpose rather than convenience. Clara spoke only when necessary, her explanations clear, restrained, unembellished. When it ended, the solicitor gathered his papers carefully. Mr. Hale is unlikely to prevail, he said, but he will not withdraw easily. Julian nodded. He never does. That evening, news reached the village. Hale's position was under formal review, not condemnation, but uncertainty. And uncertainty, Clara knew, frightened men like him far more than accusation. The response was swift. Invitations appeared, some sincere, others opportunistic. Conversations shifted tone. People who had once whispered now approached openly, curious rather than cautious. Clara observed it all with measured distance. You're becoming respectable, Aunt Margaret remarked dryly one afternoon. Clara smiled faintly. I was always respectable. Yes, Margaret said, but now they've noticed. The trial, if it could be called that, unfolded over weeks. Hearings, statements, clarifications. Through it all, Clara and Julian maintained a careful public distance. They worked together. They did not perform. And that restraint, paradoxically, drew more attention than any display might have. One evening, after a particularly long day of testimony, Clara remained behind at Hawthorne Vale. The house was quiet again. Servants dismissed. Lamps dimmed. Julian poured tea instead of wine. "I've learned something unexpected," he said, handing her a cup. "And that is?" Clara asked. "I don't want this to end," he admitted. "Not the work. Not the clarity." Clara met his gaze. "Nor do I." He hesitated, then spoke more slowly. "I am not practiced in emotional risk," Julian said, "and I won't pretend sudden eloquence." "I would mistrust it if you did," Clara replied. Julian smiled, brief, genuine. "I don't know what shape this takes," he continued, "but I know I no longer wish to build my life in isolation." Clara considered him, this man who had once confused restraint for strength, silence for safety. "Then don't," she said. He looked at her, something unguarded flickering behind his composure. "I would like," Julian said carefully, "to attempt something honest, without assurance, without guarantees." Clara felt the weight of the moment, not as romance, but as choice. "Yes," she said. The word was simple, its implications were not. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of change, not sudden, not dramatic, but inevitable. The proceedings would conclude soon. Hale would lose, but not disappear. And when they did, Clara knew the final reckoning would not be legal. It would be personal. The conclusion did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived with signatures. The final judgment was issued on a clear morning, unremarkable in every way except for its consequence. Edmund Hale's claims were dismissed. His objections dissolved under the weight of documentation, his confidence reduced to footnotes and conditions. He did not stand condemned, he stood diminished. There were penalties, financial, procedural, reputational, not ruin, not exile, but enough. Enough to ensure he would no longer move unchecked through the county, shaping narratives where facts should have stood. Julian read the decision once, then set the papers aside. "It's over," he said. Clara did not answer immediately. She stood at the window of the study, watching the fields beyond the glass. Workers moved steadily across the land, unremarkable and constant. Life undisturbed by the legal language that had threatened it. "No," she said at last, "it's finished." Julian turned toward her. "You hear a difference?" "I feel one," she replied. In the days that followed, the estate adjusted again, this time without tension. Authority settled into its proper places. Harrington remained, but with boundaries clarified and loyalties realigned. Decisions moved more quickly. Repairs long delayed were addressed, and Clara's role became unambiguous. She was not an assistant. She was not a curiosity. She was a partner in function and responsibility. The village, too, shifted. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. Invitations returned, not cautiously, but with genuine expectation. Conversations unfolded without pauses, weighted by speculation. Clara moved through familiar spaces without shrinking or bracing. Visibility, she learned, was survivable. Julian did not rush what came next. He invited her to walk the eastern boundary one afternoon, the land warmed by late-season sun, the air carrying the promise of change. They walked without hurry, their pace aligned without effort. "I've been considering something," Julian said eventually. Clara waited. "I've spent much of my life believing stability came from containment," he continued, "from minimizing risk. "And now?" she asked. "And now I see it comes from shared weight," he said, "from choosing not to carry everything alone." He stopped near the old fence line, where grass grew unevenly and the earth bore signs of long neglect. "I don't want to offer you permanence wrapped in certainty," Julian said. "I don't have that to give." Clara turned to face him fully. "I wouldn't accept it," she said. He met her gaze, something steady and resolved there now. "I want to build something," he said. "Work, life with you, in full view. Not romance, not rescue. Choice." Clara felt the truth of it settle, not with thrill, but with calm. "Yes," she said. They did not embrace. They did not mark the moment with ceremony. Instead, Julian reached into his coat and produced a ledger, worn, used. He handed it to her. "It's incomplete," he said, "and it always will be." Clara took it, understanding immediately. She opened the book, then retrieved a pencil from her pocket and wrote her name beside his on the first page. 2 hands, 1 record. That evening they sat together at the long table in the study, not facing one another, but side by side. Figures passed between them, decisions formed, margins were tested, adjusted, respected. Outside, the house settled into night, not silence, continuance. Later, as Clara prepared to leave, Julian walked her to the door. "There will be days when this is difficult," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "and moments when doubt returns." "Yes." He paused. "And if it does?" Clara met his gaze, steady and unafraid. "Then we account for it," she said, "together." Julian smiled, not with relief, but recognition. When Clara stepped into the evening, she did so without hesitation. She had not been chosen because she endured. She had been chosen because she stood. And at Hawthorne Vale, a house once ruled by silence now carried something quieter and far more enduring. Balance. Some lives are shaped not by dramatic turns, but by the courage to remain present when retreat would be easier, to be seen not as an exception, but as a choice, to build not from certainty, but from trust earned over time. If this story stayed with you, let it be a reminder. Strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply refuses to disappear. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing for more historical romances told with care, quiet tension, and human truth. Leave a comment and share what moment resonated with you most. Your presence here matters more than you know. Thank you for listening.